The sun was shining brightly over London, casting golden rays onto the historic streets as crowds of people gathered near Buckingham Palace. Among the throng of tourists snapping photos and families trying to keep their children close, Ethan stood out like a sore thumb, or rather, like a cowboy at a royal tea party. Dressed in his signature wide-brimmed hat, a leather jacket despite the warm weather, and boots that looked more suited for a ranch than a city sidewalk, Ethan wasn't exactly blending in. But that didn't bother him one bit. He loved standing out. Ethan had dreamed of visiting England ever since he was a kid growing up in Texas. His grandmother used to tell him stories about kings, queens, and castles, painting vivid pictures of a faraway land filled with history and charm. Now, finally, here he was, standing just steps away from Buckingham Palace, where the famous changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin. The air buzzed with excitement as visitors from all corners of the globe jostled for the best view. Some held cameras high above their heads, others peered through binoculars, and a few lucky ones perched on nearby benches, ready to soak it all in. As the clock ticked closer to the start of the ceremony, Ethan found himself marveling at the scene around him. There was something magical about being surrounded by so many different cultures, united by curiosity and awe. A group of Japanese tourists nearby chattered excitedly in hushed tones, while a family from Australia tried to explain the significance of the event to their wide-eyed toddler. Ethan couldn't help but smile. It was moments like these, moments of connection, that made traveling worthwhile. But amidst all the anticipation, Ethan's attention kept drifting back to the guards themselves. Standing tall and motionless in their bright red tunics and towering bearskin hats, they looked almost otherworldly. Their faces were expressionless, their posture impeccable, as though they weren't human beings at all but statues carved from stone. Ethan tilted his head, studying them closely. How did they manage to stay so still? Didn't they get bored, or hungry, or thirsty? It was then that Ethan noticed the ice cream vendor stationed a few feet away. An idea began to form in his mind, a playful, slightly ridiculous idea that made him chuckle under his breath. Without hesitation, he walked over and bought the largest cone of strawberry ice cream available. As he returned to his spot in the crowd, the cold treat already starting to drip down his fingers, Ethan glanced at the guards again. They really did look like statues, he thought. And everyone knows what happens when someone sees a statue. They can't resist having a little fun with it. With a mischievous glint in his eye, Ethan scanned the area, gauging reactions. Would anyone notice if he did something completely unexpected? The crowd was distracted, eagerly waiting for the ceremony to begin. No one seemed to be paying attention to him. Perfect. Ethan licked his ice cream, savoring the sweet, tangy flavor, and let his imagination run wild. Little did he know, his next move would turn this ordinary day into an unforgettable memory, for himself and everyone else watching. As Ethan stood there, licking his strawberry ice cream and staring at the guards, his mind began to wander. He had always been someone who liked to have a little fun, no matter where he was or what he was doing. Back home in Texas, he was known for his playful pranks, like the time he convinced his friends they could catch fish using only breadcrumbs and patience. Spoiler, it didn't work. Now, thousands of miles away from home, surrounded by strangers and history, Ethan felt a familiar spark of mischief bubbling inside him. He glanced around again, taking in the scene. The crowd was buzzing with energy, but most people were focused on the palace gates, waiting for something exciting to happen. The guards, meanwhile, remained as still as ever, their faces frozen in expressions of stoic seriousness. It was almost comical how rigid they were. Ethan leaned over to a nearby family, a mom, dad, and 2 kids, and whispered, "Do you think they even blink?" The parents exchanged amused looks before the dad replied with a chuckle, "Not sure. Maybe they're robots." Ethan laughed softly, then turned back to study the guards once more. They really did look like statues, standing there in their red uniforms and towering hats. But unlike real statues, These ones moved occasionally, shifting weight from one foot to another or adjusting their rifles ever so slightly. Still, they never broke character. Their discipline was impressive, sure, but Ethan couldn't help thinking that maybe, just maybe, they needed a little break from all the seriousness. After all, wasn't life supposed to be about having fun sometimes? That's when the idea hit him. A bold, silly, downright ridiculous idea. What if he crawled under one of the guard's legs? Just for a second. Not to cause trouble, but to add a touch of humor to the moment. Wouldn't it be funny to see how everyone reacted? And besides, who wouldn't want to lighten things up a bit? The thought made him grin from ear to ear. Ethan hesitated for a moment, weighing the pros and cons. On one hand, this could go horribly wrong. Crawling under a royal guard's legs might not exactly be considered respectful. But on the other hand, it wasn't like he was going to hurt anyone. If anything, it might make people laugh. And laughter was universal, right? Plus, he reasoned, if the guards stayed perfectly still like they were trained to do, they probably wouldn't even notice him sneaking past. Or at least, that's what he hoped. To test the waters, Ethan casually shifted closer to the nearest guard, pretending to adjust his camera angle. As he moved, he noticed the sticky residue from his melting ice cream dripping onto his fingers. Great, he thought. Now I'm making a mess everywhere. But instead of cleaning it off, he held the cone higher, determined not to let his treat go to waste. Who knew? Maybe the ice cream would come in handy later. With each passing second, Ethan's confidence grew. The crowd was distracted, the guards were immobile, and his plan seemed foolproof, or at least entertaining enough to justify the risk. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that life was too short to take everything so seriously. Besides, if he got into trouble, he could always blame it on jet lag. Grinning mischievously, Ethan decided it was now or never. Little did he know, his next move would leave an entire crowd in stitches and turn this ordinary day into a story people would talk about for years to come. Ethan's heart raced as he crouched down, his knees brushing against the cobblestones. The cool texture of the ground felt strange beneath him, but he didn't have time to think about that now. This was it, the moment of truth. He glanced up at the guard towering above him, their polished boots gleaming in the sunlight. For a split second, Ethan wondered if he'd gone completely insane. What kind of person crawls under a royal guard's legs? But then again, what kind of person travels halfway around the world and doesn't try to make things interesting? The guard hadn't moved an inch since Ethan had first approached, which gave him a small sense of reassurance. If they were going to stay perfectly still, maybe this wouldn't be such a disaster after all. Slowly, carefully, Ethan began to maneuver himself forward, keeping his ice cream cone held high like some sort of bizarre offering. "Don't drop it," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. "You've already caused enough chaos for one day." As he slid under the guard's legs, Ethan couldn't help but notice how absurd the situation was. Here he was, a grown man in a cowboy hat, crawling on all fours while holding a melting strawberry ice cream cone. If someone had told him this would happen when he woke up that morning, he would have laughed in their face. Yet here he was, living out the very definition of spontaneity. The sticky treat wobbled precariously as he moved, leaving faint pink smudges on the pristine white gloves of the guard. Ethan winced slightly, realizing that this might not go unnoticed. After all, those gloves probably cost more than his entire outfit combined. Still, he pressed on, determined to complete his mission without causing too much trouble. He figured the quicker he got through, the less likely anyone would notice, or so he hoped. By the time he reached the other side, Ethan let out a quiet sigh of relief. So far, so good. The guard hadn't budged, and the crowd seemed oblivious to his antics, or at least that's what he thought until he heard a sudden gasp from behind him. Turning his head slightly, Ethan saw a woman covering her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with shock and amusement. She wasn't alone. Several others nearby were staring at him. some giggling softly while others looked utterly baffled. For a brief moment, Ethan considered standing up and walking away, as if nothing had happened. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way the crowd reacted, or maybe it was the fact that he couldn't resist pushing things just a little further. Instead of getting up immediately, he stayed low, waving his ice cream cone dramatically, as if to say, "Ta-da." The gesture only made the crowd laugh harder, their initial surprise giving way to uncontrollable mirth. Even Ethan had to admit, this was going better than expected. Sure, he might get scolded later, or worse, banned from Buckingham Palace. But right now, he was having the time of his life. As he finally stood up, brushing imaginary dirt off his jeans, he caught sight of the guard's face. For the briefest moment, Ethan could have sworn he saw the tiniest twitch of a smile beneath the stern expression. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to confirm what he'd suspected all along. Even the most serious people appreciated a little humor every now and then. But before Ethan could bask in his triumph, reality came crashing back. A palace official appeared out of nowhere, looking equal parts exasperated and amused. "Sir," the man said firmly, though there was a hint of laughter in his voice, "you really shouldn't do that." Ethan froze, his grin faltering slightly. He knew this part was coming, but somehow he hadn't prepared for it. Now he'd have to figure out how to charm his way out of this mess. And judging by the growing number of cameras pointed in his direction, the whole world would soon know exactly what he'd done. The moment Ethan stood up, the crowd erupted into a mix of gasps, giggles, and outright laughter. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing waves of amusement that rippled through the gathered spectators. People who had been standing quietly just moments ago were now clutching their sides, wiping away tears of mirth, or pointing excitedly at the cowboy with the sticky ice cream cone. Even those who didn't fully understand English seemed to get the joke. After all, humor is universal. A group of teenagers near the front couldn't contain themselves. One of them shouted, "What just happened?" while another mimicked Ethan's crawling motion, earning roars of approval from his friends. Parents tried valiantly to maintain composure, but most failed miserably. A mother holding her toddler's hand started laughing so hard she nearly dropped her phone mid-video. Her child, confused but delighted by the chaos, clapped their hands and joined in the giggling. The scene was infectious, laughter begetting more laughter until the entire area felt like a carnival instead of a formal royal ceremony. Even the tourists filming the event found themselves torn between capturing the guards' stoic routines and zooming in on Ethan's antics. Some phones swung back and forth wildly as their owners struggled to decide where to focus. One man accidentally filmed an extended shot of his own shoes while trying to pan toward Ethan, only to realize his mistake and laugh along with everyone else. Social media feeds would later be flooded with shaky footage, blurry images, and captions like "Best Buckingham Palace Moment EVR." Amidst the commotion, Ethan looked around, taking in the reactions. He hadn't expected this level of attention or approval. Sure, he thought a few people might chuckle, but he never imagined the entire crowd would lose it. As he scanned the faces around him, he noticed a blend of emotions: surprise, delight, disbelief, and even admiration. A woman standing nearby gave him a thumbs up, whispering loudly enough for others to hear, "You've made our day." But not everyone was amused. A stern-looking older gentleman in a suit shook his head disapprovingly, muttering something about respecting tradition. His companion, however, leaned over and whispered back, "Oh, come on, lighten up. It's hilarious." The exchange caused yet another ripple of laughter among those close enough to overhear. Ethan caught the tail end of it and grinned sheepishly, realizing that even the critics were indirectly contributing to the fun. Meanwhile, the guards remained unmoved, literally. Despite the chaos unfolding around them, they stayed perfectly still, their expressions unchanged. Ethan glanced at the guard whose legs he'd crawled under, half expecting some sort of reaction. Was it possible they were robots after all? Or maybe actors hired specifically to ignore everything. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Ethan thought he saw the faintest twitch, a barely noticeable movement of the guard's jaw, as though fighting back a smile. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it confirmed what Ethan suspected. Even the most disciplined individuals weren't immune to a good laugh. The palace grounds, usually a place of quiet reverence, now buzzed with energy. Strangers introduced themselves to one another, bonding over the unexpected spectacle. A couple from Canada struck up a conversation with a family from Brazil, exchanging stories about their favorite travel moments. Someone handed Ethan a napkin, saying, "You're going to need this," which only made him laugh harder as he wiped the sticky remnants of his ice cream off his fingers. As the initial shock wore off, Ethan began to feel a strange sense of pride. He hadn't planned to become the center of attention, but somehow his silly prank had brought people together. In a world often divided by language, culture, and geography, here was proof that laughter could bridge any gap. And as the palace official approached him with a mix of sternness and suppressed amusement, Ethan knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a story he'd remember forever. As the palace official approached, Ethan felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him: nervousness, excitement, and a lingering sense of pride. He knew he'd pushed boundaries, but he also couldn't deny the joy his antics had brought to the crowd. Still, he wasn't entirely sure how this was going to play out. Would they throw him in some royal dungeon, make him write an apology letter to the queen, or maybe just scold him like a misbehaving child? Whatever it was, Ethan decided right then and there that he'd face it with the same humor and charm that had gotten him into this mess. The official stopped a few feet away, arms crossed, his expression torn between irritation and amusement. "Sir," he began, his tone firm but not unkind, "you really can't do that." Ethan nodded quickly, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "You're absolutely right," he said with a sheepish grin. "Totally my bad. I promise I won't crawl under any more legs today." His response caught the official off guard, and for a moment, the man's stern demeanor faltered. A hint of a smile tugged at the corners of his lips, though he tried hard to suppress it. The crowd, still buzzing with laughter, seemed to find Ethan's reaction hilarious. Someone shouted, "Give him a medal instead," which sent another ripple of giggles through the throng of onlookers. Determined to smooth things over, Ethan held out his melting ice cream cone toward the official as if offering a peace treaty. "Here," he said cheerfully, "you want a lick? It's strawberry." The absurdity of the gesture was too much for the official, who finally let out a short laugh despite himself. Shaking his head, he replied, "No, thank you. But perhaps you should consider finishing your snack somewhere else." Ethan took the hint and stepped back, raising both hands in a gesture of compliance. "Got it. No more crawling, no more ice cream near the guards. Lesson learned." As he turned to leave, the crowd erupted into applause, clapping and cheering as though he were a performer taking a final bow. Several people patted him on the back or gave him high fives as he made his way through the group, while others asked to take selfies with him. One elderly woman even handed him a fresh napkin, saying, "You've given us all a story we'll never forget." For a moment, Ethan felt like a celebrity. Cameras flashed, phones were thrust into his face, and strangers congratulated him on his bold move. A young boy tugged on his sleeve and asked, "Are you famous?" Ethan chuckled, crouching down to the kid's level. "Not yet," he replied with a wink, "but maybe someday." As he moved further away from the ceremony area, Ethan glanced back at the scene one last time. The guards were still standing tall and motionless, their composure unbroken. But now, the atmosphere around them felt lighter, warmer. Even the disapproving gentleman in the suit looked less grumpy, chatting animatedly with his companion. Ethan realized that his little prank hadn't just entertained the crowd. It had humanized the entire experience. For a brief moment, the rigid formality of Buckingham Palace had softened, allowing everyone to share in something spontaneous and fun. Reaching the edge of the gathering, Ethan spotted a park bench nearby and sat down to catch his breath. His ice cream was almost completely melted by now, leaving nothing but a soggy cone and sticky fingers. He licked what remained, savoring the sweetness, before tossing the remnants into a nearby trash bin. As he wiped his hands clean, he reflected on what had just happened. Sure, he might have bent a few rules. And okay, maybe he'd embarrassed himself a little, but he'd also reminded everyone present that life doesn't always have to be so serious. Sometimes, breaking the tension is exactly what people need. And judging by the laughter still echoing behind him, Ethan knew he'd done just that. By the time Ethan returned to his hotel room later that afternoon, he was exhausted, but in the best possible way. The day's events had left him buzzing with energy, replaying every moment in his mind like a movie on repeat. Crawling under the royal guard's legs, the crowd's eruption of laughter, the palace officials' half-hearted scolding. It all felt surreal, as though it had happened to someone else. But when he looked down at his sticky fingers and saw the faint pink smudges still lingering on his jeans, he knew it was very much real. As he flopped onto the bed, Ethan reached for his phone to check social media. He wasn't prepared for what he found. Notifications flooded his screen, likes, comments, shares, and messages from friends back home who had somehow already heard about his escapade. Curious, he opened one of the videos that had been shared widely online. It was footage of him mid-crawl, ice cream cone held high like a trophy, while the crowd gasped and laughed in the background. The caption read, "Tourist adds spice to Buckingham Palace ceremony." Ethan couldn't help but laugh out loud. Who would have thought his spur-of-the-moment prank would turn him into an internet sensation? Scrolling further, he discovered countless memes featuring his cowboy hat and strawberry ice cream. One meme showed him crawling under the guard's legs with the text, "When life gives you lemons, trade them for ice cream and crawl under royal guards." Another depicted him as a cartoon character winking at the camera with the tagline, "Breaking rules since 2023. The comments were equally entertaining. Some praised his creativity, calling him a legend and a folk hero, while others joked about how he'd single-handedly made the changing of the guard ceremony more exciting than anyone could have imagined. A few people even expressed their gratitude, saying his antics had brightened their day. One comment stood out to Ethan in particular. "In a world full of stress and seriousness, we need more people like this guy. Thank you, random cowboy, for reminding us to laugh." Reading through the posts, Ethan felt a strange mix of pride and humility. He hadn't set out to become famous or go viral. He'd simply wanted to have a little fun. But now, seeing how his actions had resonated with so many people, he realized there was something bigger at play. Humor, he thought, has a unique power to connect people across cultures, languages, and backgrounds. In a place as formal and historic as Buckingham Palace, his lighthearted prank had created a shared experience that everyone could enjoy. Feeling inspired, Ethan decided to embrace his newfound fame, at least for the rest of his trip. The next morning, he returned to the palace grounds, determined to make amends, and maybe pose for a few photos along the way. To his surprise, several members of the crowd recognized him immediately. "Hey, it's the ice cream guy," someone shouted, pointing at him. Within seconds, a small group gathered around, asking for pictures and autographs, which Ethan happily provided, despite feeling slightly awkward about being called famous. Even the guard seemed different this time, or maybe it was just Ethan's imagination. As he passed by the same spot where his prank had unfolded, one of the guards gave him the subtlest nod, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. Ethan grinned and tipped his cowboy hat in return, silently thanking the guard for playing along, even if unintentionally, with his silly stunt. Later that evening, as Ethan sat in a cozy pub sipping a pint of ale, he reflected on everything that had happened. His adventure might have started with a simple scoop of strawberry ice cream, but it had ended up teaching him valuable lessons about connection, joy, and the importance of embracing spontaneity. Life, he realized, is too short to take everything seriously. Sometimes, All it takes is a little humor and a willingness to stand out, to create moments that bring people together. And as he raised his glass to toast the day's events, Ethan knew this was a story he'd tell for the rest of his life. By the time Ethan's trip to London was nearing its end, his ice cream escapade had become the stuff of legend, not just online, but among the locals and tourists he encountered daily. Every time he ventured out, someone would recognize him. Whether it was the cowboy hat, his easygoing demeanor, or simply the fact that his face was plastered all over social media, people couldn't resist approaching him. Some wanted selfies, others wanted to hear the full story, even though most of them already knew it, and a few even treated him like some kind of celebrity. One morning, as Ethan strolled through Covent Garden, a street performer dressed as a mime stopped mid-act to point at him dramatically. The crowd gathered around the mime turned their heads in unison, spotting Ethan with his unmistakable grin and cowboy hat. "It's the ice cream guy," one person shouted, and within moments, the mime abandoned his routine entirely. Instead, he began mimicking Ethan's infamous crawl under the guard's legs, complete with exaggerated movements and an imaginary ice cream cone held high above his head. The audience roared with laughter, clapping and cheering, as if they were watching the highlight reel of Ethan's life. For a moment, Ethan felt like he'd stepped into a surreal alternate reality, where he was both the prankster and the main attraction. But the attention wasn't limited to strangers. Back at his hotel, the staff greeted him warmly every day, often slipping little notes into his room saying things like, "Thanks for the laughs," or "You're our favorite guest." Even the concierge had started calling him Mr. Ice Cream, instead of using his real name. At first, Ethan found it amusing, but as the days went by, he realized how much joy his silly stunt had brought not only to himself, but to everyone around him. It was strange and humbling to think that something so small could have such a big impact. On his final day in London, Ethan decided to visit Buckingham Palace one last time. He didn't plan on repeating his earlier antics. Instead, he wanted to see the place again without causing any trouble. As he approached the gates, he noticed a group of tourists taking turns posing for photos near the guards. When they spotted him, their eyes lit up with recognition. "Hey, it's him," one of them exclaimed, waving enthusiastically. Before Ethan could react, he was surrounded by smiling faces, each person eager to capture a memory with the man who had dared to defy tradition. What surprised Ethan most, however, was the reaction of the palace officials this time around. One of them, a different official than the one who had scolded him before, approached him with a friendly smile. "We've been hearing quite a lot about you," the man said, shaking Ethan's hand. "I must admit, you've put a smile on a lot of faces this week." Ethan chuckled nervously, unsure of what to say. "I hope I didn't cause too much trouble," he replied. The official waved off his concern. "Not at all. In fact, we could use more people like you, people who remind us not to take ourselves too seriously." As Ethan walked away from the palace for the last time, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. His prank had started as a spontaneous act of fun, but it had grown into something far greater. It had connected him with countless people, sparked laughter across continents, and reminded everyone involved, including himself, that happiness can come from the simplest, most unexpected moments. That evening, sitting in Heathrow Airport waiting for his flight home, Ethan scrolled through his phone one last time. The hashtags #ice cream diplomacy and #cowboy at the police were trending worldwide, accompanied by thousands of comments praising his lighthearted spirit. A news article titled "How One Tourist Brought Joy to Buckingham Palace" caught his eye, describing his prank as a perfect blend of humor and humanity. Reading those words, Ethan smiled to himself. He hadn't set out to change the world, but maybe, just maybe, he'd made it a tiny bit brighter. And as the plane took off into the night sky, Ethan knew he'd carry the lessons of this adventure with him forever. Ethan finally landed back in Texas, stepping off the plane with his cowboy boots firmly on home soil. He couldn't help but feel a bittersweet mix of emotions. On one hand, he was thrilled to be back. There's nothing quite like the wide-open skies and warm hospitality of his hometown. On the other hand, leaving behind the whirlwind adventure of London felt like closing a chapter of his life that had been unexpectedly magical. But as he drove down familiar roads lined with fields and cattle ranches, he realized something important. The lessons he learned during his trip weren't going anywhere. They were coming home with him. The first thing Ethan did when he got back was visit his grandmother, the woman who had sparked his love for travel and storytelling. Sitting on her porch swing, sipping sweet tea, he recounted every detail of his journey, from the awe-inspiring sight of Buckingham Palace to the absurdity of crawling under a guard's legs with a melting ice cream cone. His grandmother listened intently, laughing so hard at certain parts that she nearly spilled her tea. "Ethan," she said, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes, "you've always had a knack for making people smile. But this takes the cake, or should I say, the ice cream." Word of Ethan's antics spread quickly through his small town, thanks in part to the viral videos that had reached even the quietest corners of the internet. Neighbors stopped him at the grocery store to ask if he really was that guy from the memes. Friends teased him relentlessly, calling him International Man of Mystery, and insisting he autograph their napkins at the local diner. At first, Ethan found it amusing, but soon he began to see how much joy his story brought to those around him. In a community where life often moved at a slower pace, his tale of mischief and laughter added a spark of excitement. But beyond the jokes and attention, Ethan noticed something deeper happening. People started sharing their own stories of spontaneity and fun, inspired by his willingness to embrace the unexpected. A young boy told him about the time he convinced his parents to let him wear pajamas to school for Spirit Day. An elderly neighbor confessed she once dyed her hair bright blue just to shock her grandchildren. These moments, big or small, reminded Ethan of what he'd discovered in London. Humor has a way of connecting us, breaking down barriers, and reminding us of our shared humanity. One evening, sitting around a campfire with friends, Ethan reflected on how much his perspective had shifted since his trip. Before, he'd seen himself as just another guy from Texas who liked to have a little fun. Now he understood that having fun wasn't just about personal enjoyment. It was about creating ripples of positivity that could touch others' lives. That realization stayed with him long after the flames of the campfire died down. Months later, as Ethan sat on his porch watching the sunset, he pulled out his phone to scroll through old photos from his trip. There was one picture in particular that made him smile, a selfie he'd taken with a group of strangers outside Buckingham Palace, all of them grinning ear to ear. Beneath the photo, someone had commented, "Thanks for reminding us to find joy in the little things." Reading those words again, Ethan felt a swell of gratitude, not just for the adventure itself, but for the connections it had forged. In the end, Ethan knew that life wasn't about waiting for grand opportunities or perfect moments. It was about seizing the chances to make people laugh, to break the monotony, and to remind everyone, including himself, that we're all human. Whether it was through a prank involving ice cream or simply wearing a cowboy hat halfway around the world, Ethan had learned that sometimes the smallest acts of silliness leave the biggest impressions. And as he leaned back in his chair, watching the stars twinkle above the Texas horizon, Ethan smiled. He didn't need Buckingham Palace or viral fame to keep spreading joy. All he needed was an open heart, a playful spirit, and maybe, just maybe, a fresh scoop of strawberry ice cream.